The prairie stretched wide and empty, a sea of ochre grass and dust under a pale morning sky. Caleb Thorne's cabin sat at the edge of that expanse, its weathered timbers leaning slightly, as if bowing to the weight of years and solitude. For 10 long years, he had lived here alone, tending to the cattle, mending fences, and listening to the whisper of wind through the dry stalks. The past lingered in every corner. The memory of his wife's soft laugh in the kitchen, the echo of tiny footsteps on the porch, letters never sent and photographs that yellowed with time. Grief had a rhythm, and in it, Caleb had built a life measured by quiet, solitude, and the occasional creak of a gate in the wind. That morning, a carriage rumbled along the rutted track, carrying a sound Caleb had not heard for a decade, wheels against gravel. He stepped outside, squinting at the dust rising in the sunrise. The horse pulling the carriage snorted, stamping impatiently, while the driver waved and then disappeared with a final kick of reins down the track. And then she stepped out, a young woman, her shawl damp with dew, boots muddy, eyes wide and wary. She held a small satchel to her chest, as if it contained every shred of hope she had left in the world. Caleb's first instinct was suspicion. A mail-order bride, yes, but not the one he had written for. Letters misdirected, names confused. Her arrival was a mistake. He kept his face impassive, though a tremor of curiosity stirred beneath the practiced calm. "You must be Anna," he said, his voice low, measured like gravel over iron. "This isn't quite what I expected." Anna's lips parted, uncertain. I believe so, sir," she said, her voice trembling between hope and fear. "The letters! They said to come here." She glanced at the cabin, at the fences that had long ceased to hold more than dust and stray grass. Her eyes softened as they took in the rocking chair by the fire, the stacked wood beside the door, the smoke curling from the chimney into the crisp morning air. He gestured toward the porch. "Come inside. Coffee first." The words were simple, almost brusque, but the invitation carried weight. Anna followed, her steps careful, boots leaving faint prints on the wooden boards. Inside, Caleb reached for a chipped tin cup, filling it from the kettle that sang softly over the embers. The firelight caught the motes of dust that floated lazily in the air, golden and ephemeral, like tiny sparks of memory. He handed her the cup without meeting her gaze, and she accepted it, hands warming on the metal as if holding on to courage itself. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. It was a silence heavy with years of loss, and yet within it lay a fragile promise. Anna watched him, noting the lines etched by grief, the way his hands moved with quiet precision as he set the kettle back on the stove. Caleb's gaze drifted to the wall, to the faded photographs pinned to wood, to the space where laughter had once lived. He did not speak of it. It was not the way of men who had weathered sorrow alone, but the presence of another human being, her tentative, nervous, small but steady presence, stirred something dormant. She dared a small observation. "Your rocking chair, does it still remember?" He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. "It remembers what it remembers. Sit if you like." She did, and for a moment, the two of them existed in parallel rhythms. The slow crackle of fire, the faint whistle of wind against the window, and the quiet awareness of company after a decade of isolation. Outside, the prairie wind pressed against the timbers, carrying dust and grass seeds like confetti of the old world, the past brushing against the present. Inside, the kettle's faint hiss and the muted clink of tin were the only markers of life. Caleb, as he poured another cup of coffee for himself, noticed the tremor in her hands, the faint tremor that spoke of nights spent afraid or alone. He remembered his own mornings years ago, when the absence of voices weighed heavier than the earth itself. He realized, in that quiet, unspoken way that men like him understood, that presence alone could be a balm. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but the soft beginning of something that might, with time, be like a river carving its way through stone. Anna, for her part, studied him with careful attentiveness. She noted the patchwork of scars on his hands, the faint curve of a brow lifted in thought, the way he measured each step, each gesture. She understood that here safety was not a matter of locks or fences, but of patience, of restraint, of understanding. She would not rush him, and in that she found her own quiet courage. Outside, the sun climbed higher, scattering light across the prairie, gilding the fence posts and the dry grass. Dust motes danced like tiny heralds of possibility, settling slowly around the cabin. Inside, the fire cast long shadows, stretching across the floor like fingers reaching into the past. Caleb finally allowed himself a fraction of a smile, not wide, not bold, but enough. Enough to acknowledge that life, in its unpredictable and often mistaken ways, could offer a companion after all. In that morning hush, with coffee warming their hands and the prairie stretching infinite beyond the windows, a small truce was formed. Loneliness met tentative curiosity, and in the quiet corners of the cabin, hope began its slow, patient work. Symbolism, dust, rocking chair, damp shawl, first firelight, morning prairie wind. The days settled like dust on the porch boards, thin layers of quiet that Caleb and Anna could navigate without words. Each morning, the sun rose over the prairie in a pale wash of gold, illuminating the rolling grass and the fences Caleb had built, with hands that knew both labor and loneliness. He moved through his chores with the same steady rhythm as always, mending gates, checking water troughs, tending cattle, but now, Anna's presence pressed softly against the edges of his routine. She moved like a cautious shadow, never imposing, yet always observing. One afternoon she lingered by the tool shed, running her fingers over the cracked handles of hammers and axes left by Caleb's father, tools that bore the imprint of years and hands that were long gone. "These tools," she murmured almost to herself. "They carry so much." Caleb glanced at her over his shoulder, wiping sweat from his brow. "Everything carries weight," he said simply, and returned to repairing a fence post. His eyes lingered on the horizon, where the wind swept through the prairie grass in waves, bending and rising as if alive. The wind had always carried whispers for him, the echo of laughter, the cry of children, the sharp sting of absence. Anna, in the evenings, would watch him tend the fire, noting the subtle lines of grief etched into his movements, the way he polished his rifle, running cloth over worn steel absent-mindedly, or traced the shape of a braid in the air, a braid that reminded him of his daughter, gone long before her time. She did not speak of it, but her own fingers ached to braid something, to hold a life that had once been hers, now dispersed by loss and circumstance. Their conversations were tentative at first, punctuated by long silences that stretched and bent like the prairie horizon. She told fragments of her story: family lost to fever, a journey as a mail-order bride gone awry, expectations never sought but thrust upon her. Caleb listened without interruption, hands busy with chores, letting her words settle like seeds in the soil. There was no pity in his attention, only acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, Anna felt an ember of understanding, fragile but persistent. The ranch itself seemed alive, reflecting their unspoken emotions. Gates creaked under the weight of wind, cornstalks whispered in the twilight, and the old rocking chair by the fire sighed with memories. Each object was a vessel of past lives, the scuffed floorboards telling of hurried steps and quiet dances, the kettle that had boiled over for decades, the rifle leaning in the corner, silent and watchful. Anna began to see the land not just as Caleb's home, but as a mirror of their shared grief, a place where sorrow could exist, but not define. One evening after supper, Caleb allowed Anna to sit beside him at the fire. The flames licked the hearth, casting golden light that flickered across his rugged face. He spoke softly. The first time in years he had let his voice carry the weight of memory. My wife, she liked mornings like this," he said, gesturing toward the firelight and the shadows dancing on the walls. "Said the dust in the sun made the world feel alive, even when nothing else did." Anna reached out, touching the edge of his sleeve, a small gesture of empathy that did not require words. "And your children?" she asked, her voice a whisper, careful not to disturb the fragile thread he was holding. Caleb's eyes darkened, distant. Gone. Too soon. His hand traced an invisible braid, the ghost of a life that had been cut short. He did not ask for comfort, nor did he shy from sharing the quiet pain. In that moment, the cabin became a sanctuary, not from the world, but from the silence that had weighed on them both for so long. They began to understand that grief had shaped them, yet had not imprisoned them. The silence between their words became less oppressive, a space where reflection could breathe. Anna learned to move in tandem with his rhythms, carrying water when he tended the cattle, helping mend fences, or simply sitting nearby with no expectation but presence. Caleb, in turn, began to acknowledge her gestures, subtle signs that the world could be both dangerous and kind, both lonely and companionable. The wind through the corn stalks became a melody, carrying the scent of earth and rain, the promise of growth even amid barrenness. The firelight illuminated old tools, revealing their edges worn smooth by use and care, reminding them that even in hardship, there was labor, purpose, and continuity. Nightly, the prairie stretched silent and infinite, but the cabin held warmth, human warmth, a fragile tether to life after loss. One morning, as the sun rose behind low clouds, Caleb handed Anna a cup of coffee. Steam curled between them, and for a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the prairie wind rattled the fence posts, and the distant cry of a hawk punctuated the quiet. In that simple ritual, sharing warmth, observing each other, existing without pretense, they recognized the beginnings of trust, of mutual understanding. They were haunted, yes, but together they were not broken. Together, they could inhabit the space between grief and hope. And so, the days settled into their uneasy rhythm, shadows of the past lingering yet no longer dictating the present. Each gesture, each glance, each soft word by firelight became an act of survival, a recognition that even after loss, hearts could carry empathy, and solitude could yield to connection. Emotional tone and realization, reflection and sorrow deepen understanding. Both Caleb and Anna realized that solitude has shaped, but not defined, their capacity for empathy. Their shared presence allows grief to exist alongside hope, and small gestures become acts of profound connection. Symbolism, braids, old tools, wind through corn, firelight as memory, silent gestures of empathy. The afternoon sky darkened with unnatural haste, clouds rolling in thick and heavy over the endless prairie. Caleb Thorne had seen many storms, but this one came like a wall, sudden and unannounced, swallowing the horizon and turning the sun to a dull, diffused gray. The wind picked up with a keening shriek, rattling the cabin's timbers and bending the dry grass in waves that seemed to chase one another across the plains. Caleb moved quickly, securing the shutters, stacking wood higher near the hearth and calling Anna inside as the first sheets of rain rattled the roof. Anna entered, her shawl plastered to her shoulders, hair damp and clinging to her face. She shivered, but her eyes were steady, reflecting both curiosity and fear. Caleb gestured toward the fire and she stepped close, drawing in its warmth. The cabin, cramped and dim, suddenly felt suffocating in its closeness. And yet, in that constriction, there was no space for avoidance. They were brought together by circumstance, pressed into shared survival. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating their faces in stark relief, shadows flitting across the walls. The storm outside was a brutal, unrelenting force, and within the cabin, tension mirrored the chaos. Caleb gripped his rifle, not out of anticipation of hunting, but instinctive vigilance, muscles coiled from a lifetime of isolation. Anna's hands, damp from the rain, clutched the mug she had been using, knuckles white, but movements careful, precise. A sudden knock on the door startled them both. Caleb's brow furrowed. "Who goes there?" he demanded, voice low but edged with caution. "A traveler." "I'm hurt." "Please," came a rasped reply, carried faintly over the storm. Through the curtain of rain, a man's figure appeared, slouched against the wind, soaked and trembling. Caleb studied him, weighing the risk of opening the door against the compulsion to act. Years of self-reliance and fear of intrusion warred with the deep, stubborn thread of morality that had never entirely eroded. Anna stepped forward, softer in tone. "We must help him," she said. Her hands were steady as she opened the door, helping the stranger inside. His boots left muddy prints across the floor, and he leaned heavily against the wall, panting and shivering. Anna guided him to a chair by the fire, brushing damp hair from his face with a quiet gentleness that seemed almost unnatural in a place so long governed by solitude. Caleb's eyes never left the stranger, noting every twitch and flicker of movement. He measured the danger, instinctively calculating whether the man was a threat or merely a soul in need. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the stranger's hollow cheeks and the weariness in his eyes. For a moment, fear and suspicion hung thick in the room. As tangible as the heat rising from the fire, Anna moved with calm precision, removing a torn sleeve to dress a bleeding wrist. Murmuring softly to the man as Caleb kept watch, he noticed the courage in her hands, the steadiness in her gaze, and something in him shifted. In that storm, with danger and vulnerability pressing in from all sides, he saw her not as an intrusion but as an ally, someone capable of care and bravery in equal measure. The storm raged for hours, battering the cabin with rain, hail, and the roar of wind. Caleb and Anna worked silently in tandem. He propped the fire higher. She tended to the stranger's injuries, both of them navigating cramped space with an unspoken understanding. Outside, the prairie groaned under the assault, the skeletal branches of distant trees bending like supplicants, and the lightning carved jagged paths across the sky. The stranger, after a long moment of pain and shivering, managed a weak smile. "Thank you. I thought I'd be gone before morning," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, raw from exposure, but steady in the acknowledgement of their aid. Anna handed him a cloth to dry his hands. Glancing at Caleb, their eyes met across the firelight. A silent exchange of recognition. Danger and trust could coexist. Protection did not require isolation. Empathy did not demand vulnerability be abandoned. The wind tore through the cabin again, rattling shutters and throwing gusts of cold air across the floor. Caleb shifted slightly, his hand brushing against Anna's as he moved past her to tend the fire. Neither spoke of it. Words were unnecessary. In that brush, in that shared labor under the storm's relentless fury, they felt the quiet assurance that connection could survive, even thrive, in the most hostile of conditions. When the storm finally began to abate, the sky fractured into sheets of pale light, casting rainbowed droplets across the cabin window. The stranger, now bandaged and steadied, rose on unsteady legs. He nodded to them both, gratitude etched into every line of his body. "I won't forget this," he said quietly, before stepping back into the damp expanse, the prairie wind whisking him away toward uncertain horizons. Silence returned, filled only with the crackle of the hearth and the distant drip of water from the eaves. Caleb sat heavily in the chair, rifle set aside, and allowed himself to breathe in a way he hadn't in years. Anna folded her wet shawl and placed it near the fire, her movements deliberate, careful, reverent. The cabin smelled of wet wool, scorched wood, and earth carried in by the storm, a scent that lingered long after the wind had passed. The firelight danced across faces and hands, illuminating traces of fatigue, bravery, and the unspoken bonds forming between them. The storm outside had been a trial, yet within the tiny walls of the cabin, they had endured together and apart, each learning that vigilance and trust could coexist. In the quiet aftermath, Caleb finally allowed a slow exhale, a release of tension years in the making. Anna, her gaze lingering on the horizon now clear and wide, understood that even in chaos, there could be sanctuary. They had survived together, not because words had been spoken, but because presence and courage had done the speaking for them. For the first time in years, the prairie outside seemed less vast, less lonely. Within the firelit walls, amid wet shawls and the scent of rain, a tentative trust had been forged, one that neither storm nor stranger could undo. And for Caleb, that small, fragile ember of connection glimmered against a backdrop of 10 years of solitude, promising that perhaps the world still held room for compassion, courage, and eventually, something resembling hope, emotional tone and realization. Shared danger ignites trust. Both Caleb and Anna realize protection and empathy can coexist with self-preservation. Danger, vulnerability, and courage are intertwined, revealing the depth of their growing connection. Symbolism. Storm. Firelight, wet shawls, lightning as sudden revelation, prairie wind as cleansing. The prairie had recovered from the storm, yet the air still hummed with its memory. Sunlight fell in muted streaks through the cabin windows, illuminating motes of dust that floated lazily in the lingering warmth. Caleb Thorne moved among the familiar objects of his home with a measured precision, but there was a restlessness in his posture, a tension beneath his broad shoulders that Anna could feel even when he said nothing. The storm had passed, yet its echoes lingered, not in the wind outside, but in the quiet, insistent pull of companionship that now filled the small cabin. Anna observed him from across the room, her hands folded over a damp towel. She noticed the faded wedding dress tucked carefully into the chest by the far wall, the letters stacked in neat yellowed piles that had never been sent, the scars along his hands that spoke of years of labor and of pain endured without complaint. Each of these remnants whispered to her about the man he had been before solitude claimed him, a man shaped by love lost and responsibilities abandoned to memory. Their interactions had grown quiet, but laden with meaning. They passed meals across the table with unspoken consideration, exchanged glances while stacking firewood, and carried out shared chores with a tacit understanding that their presence was no longer intrusion but necessity. Yet every action carried a weight, a hesitation born of unacknowledged emotions. Caleb would polish the rifle with deliberate care, while Anna quietly tended the kettle, their eyes meeting only briefly, a spark of acknowledgement passing between them. One afternoon, while repairing a fence near the cabin, Anna froze, her gaze catching on a coiled form in the grass. A rattlesnake, its tail flicking a slow warning, lay poised near the path they had to cross. Caleb's hand instinctively went to the rifle, but Anna stepped forward, calm and deliberate. Together, they worked as a single unit. She distracted the snake with a stick, coaxing it away from the porch, while he kept careful watch, every motion precise and deliberate. The tension was palpable, their proximity unavoidable, yet neither faltered. When the danger passed, they exhaled nearly simultaneously, a small shared relief that did not require words. Caleb, for the first time in weeks, allowed himself to glance at Anna, not with suspicion, but with quiet acknowledgement. She was no mistake, no intruder to be tolerated. She was a presence that brought order and warmth to a home long abandoned, a companion who navigated both danger and silence with courage. Evenings settled over the cabin like a heavy quilt. They sat by the fire, the flames casting long shadows that danced along the walls, illuminating the worn floorboards and the brass handles of old tools. Caleb traced the edges of the hearth absently, thoughts drifting like smoke, and Anna braided a strip of leather for a broken harness, her fingers moving with habitual care. In the quiet, their glances held more meaning than words ever could. The recognition of shared survival, the acknowledgement of unspoken trust, and the slow awakening of something neither dared to name aloud. Caleb found himself noticing her small habits, the way she smoothed her damp hair back from her face after chores, the careful way she measured flour into the mixing bowl, the steadiness of her hands even in moments of fear. Each observation chipped away at the wall he had built around his heart. He realized that he had spent so long alone, not because he was unwilling to love, but because he had believed solitude was safer, easier, less likely to hurt. Anna's presence was proof that some walls could be dismantled by quiet patience and consistent courage. Anna, for her part, had begun to see the cabin differently. It was no longer merely a refuge from the world, but a space where trust and intimacy could grow in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The firelight glinting off the old brass of Caleb's tools, the carefully folded letters, the faint scent of pine smoke in the air, all of it became part of a narrative that she was quietly piecing together, a story of a man who had survived loss and could now, perhaps, survive companionship. A sudden gust of wind rattled the shutters, and Caleb instinctively moved to secure them, brushing past Anna. Their shoulders touched, lightly but with the weight of proximity, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that had built between them. Neither spoke, yet both understood. Trust was forming here, forged not in declarations but in shared labor, in the quiet management of danger. in the intimacy of gestures, small yet deliberate. By nightfall, the prairie had settled into a calm lull. The fire burned low, casting amber light across the cabin, and the shadows seemed to lean close, listening to the quiet rhythms of two people learning to coexist. Caleb sat back in the rocking chair, hands folded over his knees, and allowed himself to simply observe Anna as she arranged dishes and swept the floor. The tension beneath the roof had not vanished. It lingered like smoke, but it was no longer oppressive. It was the heat of possibility, the subtle ignition of slow-burn intimacy. In that moment, Caleb realized that companionship need not demand immediate vulnerability. It required patience, observation, and courage, the same qualities that Anna had displayed in the face of the storm and the snake. And Anna understood that trust could grow gradually, shaped by repeated gestures of care and steadfast presence. That intimacy was less about words than the rhythm of shared life. Together, in the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by firelight, worn tools, and shadows that had once held only grief, they began to build something fragile and enduring. The prairie outside stretched infinite, but within the small cabin, a tentative connection was taking root, one that promised warmth, order, and the subtle promise of love without forcing its proclamation. Emotional tone and realization, slow-burn intimacy, and mutual recognition of trust. Caleb and Anna realized that connection can grow through small gestures, shared labor, and moments of mutual reliance, symbolism, wedding dress, firelight, scars, snake as latent danger, shadows as unspoken emotion. Winter had arrived quietly, at first with brittle mornings and frost etched across the cabin windows, and then with heavy, unrelenting snow blanketing the prairie in a soft, immaculate white. The land seemed to hold its breath beneath the thick layer, as though the world itself paused, offering reprieve from the constant winds and dust of the seasons past. Inside the cabin, Caleb Thorne tended the fire with a steady hand, listening to the occasional crackle of flame as it licked the edges of logs long dried in the summer heat. Anna sat nearby, braiding a strip of his hair with gentle fingers. The movements rhythmic and absent-minded, a quiet intimacy that neither felt compelled to explain. Caleb's voice, low and measured, filled the otherwise silent cabin. He spoke of mornings long gone, of children's laughter that had once echoed in these same walls, of the fleeting smiles of a wife whose memory was stitched into every timber. Anna listened, her own hands still busy, her eyes flicking between the firelight and his features, noting the subtle tremor in his jaw as he recalled the past. In the warmth of the hearth, they existed in a fragile suspension, two souls bearing loss, learning that shared silence could be as revealing as speech. The fire cast long shadows across the room, stretching over the faded wedding dress tucked neatly in the chest, over the worn floorboards and across Caleb's calloused hands. Each flicker illuminated the transformation that had taken place in small, almost imperceptible increments. The slow thawing of grief, the quiet acceptance of companionship, the tentative growth of trust. Neither spoke of the bond forming between them. It was understood through gestures, the braid she wove absent-mindedly, the way he allowed her presence near the hearth, the soft exhalations in the cold air as they adjusted to proximity after years of solitude. Yet winter's stillness could not shield them from the world outside. A neighbor arrived one afternoon, trudging through snowdrifts to question Anna's presence. His words were sharp, a blend of curiosity and judgment. "She doesn't belong here, Caleb. This isn't proper." The words struck the cabin like wind through a broken shutter. Caleb's eyes narrowed, the firelight reflecting in the ice-blue depths. For a moment, he remembered the years he had spent protecting his land from intrusions, his pride in isolation, and the fears that solitude had nurtured. Anna's gaze met his, calm and unwavering. She did not flinch, did not argue. She trusted him, as he had learned to trust her, that protection and dignity could coexist. Caleb's response was measured yet firm, a gesture of silent assertion. He stood, walking to the door and securing it, the rifle resting near the hearth as a quiet reminder that the safety of the cabin, and of Anna, was non-negotiable. In that simple act, He declared what words could not, that she belonged here as much as he did, and that he would not allow society's judgment to dictate their lives. Evening settled over the prairie like a soft exhalation, the snow reflecting the pale light of the waning sun. Inside, the fire continued to glow, warming the cabin, burning away the chill not just of winter, but of years spent in emotional isolation. Caleb returned to his chair, Anna resuming the braid in silence. Their hands brushed occasionally, each touch deliberate yet understated, a tacit acknowledgement of connection. The room smelled of burning pine, of the faint scent of soap on Anna's hands, of earth and wet wool carried in from the snow outside. Caleb's eyes traced the braid in his hair, noting the care with which she worked, and realized that he had grown to rely on these small gestures of presence. Anna too noticed the subtle signs of trust, the way he allowed her near, the way his shoulders relaxed when she spoke softly, the quiet pride in his gaze as he looked toward the hearth where warmth and safety had been forged anew. They did not speak of love, for neither was ready to name it, yet its presence was undeniable. It existed in the steady rhythm of shared tasks, in the unhurried passing of time, in glances and gestures that conveyed more than words ever could. Caleb found comfort in the braid, in the firelight dancing over her fingers, in the quiet assurance that someone had come to care for him without demanding his grief be set aside. Anna found hope in the steady weight of his hand near hers, in the acceptance of her presence, and in the unspoken promise of protection and partnership. Night deepened, and the snow outside pressed softly against the cabin walls. Caleb moved to the chest and, almost absent-mindedly, adjusted the wedding dress tucked within, a gesture of respect for the past and the memories it held. He did not speak. Words were unnecessary. Anna, observing him, understood that his acknowledgement of loss did not diminish the life they were quietly building. Each of them had carried burdens long before this winter, yet here, together, they found space to lay them down without abandoning their identity or their dignity. As the fire burned low, Caleb extended a hand toward Anna. She placed hers in his, their fingers intertwining with a delicate familiarity that had been forged over weeks of shared silence and quiet work. In that clasp, there was warmth, trust, and the first, fragile bloom of intimacy, a recognition that even after loss, hearts could still be open, capable of care, capable of love. Outside, the snow continued its gentle descent, settling like a blanket over the prairie, a quiet absolution. Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight, casting shadows that stretched across the room like protective arms. Two souls, scarred and weathered, had found solace in one another, not through declarations, not through dramatic confessions, but through presence, patience, and the subtle choreography of survival and empathy. The night carried them both into a peaceful quiet, a reprieve from grief and loneliness, a tentative step toward healing. The fire between them was more than warmth. It was a symbol of trust, safety, and the possibility of new beginnings. In the stillness, with hands clasped and hair braided, Caleb and Anna understood that care and companionship could be as enduring as the prairie itself, as silent yet powerful as the snow falling softly beyond the cabin walls. Emotional tone and realization, healing through quiet companionship. Caleb and Anna realized that love and care can emerge from patience and understanding, not from sudden passion. Their intimacy is built on shared presence, empathy, and the steadfast protection of one another. Symbolism, snow, fire, braids, clasped hands, wedding dress as hope, firelight as transformation. The prairie was still heavy with the memory of winter, snow clinging in stubborn patches to the undulating hills. Yet beneath the white, the earth waited, patient and enduring. Caleb Thorne had risen before dawn, tending the hearth while the sky bled pale gold along the horizon. The silence was broken only by the distant call of a hawk and the occasional crunch of snow under hoof. Yet this morning carried tension, an unease that settled like frost along his spine. He had spotted them the day before, strangers with eyes sharp as hawks, claiming they had come to claim the land that had been his for decades. Bandits, Caleb thought. Opportunists drawn to isolation and rumor. Anna stood nearby, her shawl wrapped tightly about her shoulders, hands busy with the small preparations of the morning. She sensed Caleb's vigilance, the taut muscles in his shoulders, the careful survey of fences and gates, and she knew this day would demand more than words or gentle glances. It would demand courage, instinct, and the trust they had slowly built together over months of shared silence, labor, and quiet understanding. The first signs came as distant shadows on the snow, the glint of steel and the muffled sound of hooves against frozen earth. Caleb's rifle was ready, resting near the hearth, while Anna moved beside him, a steady presence, her eyes following his motions with unspoken coordination. Neither flinched. In those long months, they had learned the rhythm of one another's movements, the tilt of a shoulder, the shift of weight, the timing of breaths. Here, all that learning would be tested. The bandits arrived without warning, their voices carrying harsh commands across the pale expanse. Caleb stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "This land is not yours," he said, tone measured and unwavering. Anna stayed close, hands near her satchel, ready to assist, ready to act. Their shared glance carried the weight of unspoken strategy and trust. The confrontation was swift, methodical, without drama or unnecessary flourish. Caleb's rifle barked once, twice, precise and controlled, a warning as much as a measure of defense. The bandits, recognizing the steadfast courage in the man and the quiet determination in the woman beside him, faltered. Anna moved with careful decisiveness, blocking a path, diverting a strike, keeping the intruders at bay without raising a hand in aggression. In the frozen light of dawn, justice was delivered not through vengeance but through courage, skill, and empathy, a moral reckoning as sharp and clean as the winter air. When the last of the bandits retreated, Caleb lowered his rifle, letting it rest against the post. Anna exhaled softly, brushing snow from her sleeves. They regarded one another briefly, a shared recognition passing between them. They had endured danger together, survived through coordination and trust, and emerged not only unbroken, but strengthened. The prairie, once menacing under the threat of strangers, now opened to the soft glow of sunrise. Gold and rose bled across the horizon, illuminating the snow with a gentle warmth. The wind carried a promise of renewal, brushing through the tall prairie grass and tugging lightly at Anna's braid, which fluttered like a banner of resilience. Caleb adjusted his saddle, glancing at her with a quiet smile, a gesture both simple and profound. They rode side by side, hooves crunching through thawing snow, rifles resting silently across the backs of their saddles. The cabin receded behind them, its worn timbers and familiar shadows a testament to past loss and endurance. Every log, every shuttered window, held memories of grief and solitude, but also of the small, patient victories that had brought them to this moment. Trust built in silence, courage demonstrated in firelight and storm, empathy extended without demand. As they crossed the plains, the wind tugged again at Anna's braid and Caleb reached across, steadying it with a hand both protective and gentle. No words were necessary. The gesture conveyed months of shared understanding. They had each carried burdens that once seemed insurmountable, yet now, together, those burdens felt lighter, tempered by mutual care and the quiet triumph of companionship. The sun climbed higher, gilding the prairie in shimmering light, revealing distant hills and streams, fences stretching to the horizon, and the subtle promise of a future unclaimed by past sorrow. In that vast openness, Caleb and Anna felt the true measure of their journey. The land had been a crucible, and in it they had discovered not only survival, but resilience, trust, and the delicate beginnings of love. By midday, they paused atop a gentle rise, looking back at the cabin silhouetted against the snow and sky. Caleb traced the edges of the roof with his gaze, a silent acknowledgement of all that had passed within its walls. Loss endured, storms weathered, and the quiet forging of bonds that neither time nor hardship could undo. Anna leaned close, her breath mingling with his in the crisp air, her hand finding his. Fingers intertwined, warm against cold, steady against uncertainty. For the first time in years, the prairie felt expansive not as a void, but as an opportunity, a space where hearts could heal, where trust could flourish, and where connection could endure beyond fear and solitude. Their ride continued, steady and measured, the horizon stretching endless before them, a landscape of possibility rather than limitation. The snow, the frost, the pale light, all bore witness to their passage from isolation into unity, from guarded caution into shared strength. In the quiet of the open prairie, Caleb and Anna did not speak of love, nor did they need to. Their companionship, born of hardship and mutual reliance, was enough. Every glance, every brush of hands, every careful maneuver of saddle and reins carried the weight of months of discovery, that hearts broken by loss could find one another, that dignity could be maintained even in vulnerability, that safety and tenderness were not mutually exclusive. As the cabin receded further behind them, the prairie opened to the soft, cinematic light of dawn fully realized. Caleb glanced at Anna, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of his own heart, scarred, resilient, and finally open to the possibility of life shared. They rode forward together, a pair bound by trust, by courage, and by the quiet triumph of hearts healing in tandem. Emotional tone and realization, resolution, relief, and hope. Caleb and Anna realized that love, dignity, and safety can exist even after years of abandonment. Their journey through danger, silence, and companionship has forged a bond stronger than fear, a quiet, enduring triumph of trust and care, symbolism, sunrise, rifles at rest, open prairie, braids fluttering in the wind, cabin as past loss, horizon as second chances.